And hello, Hearts of Oak. Thanks so much for joining us once again. It's great to have Jan Jekielek back with us again, Epoch Times Supremo. Jan, it's always good to chat with you. Thanks so much for giving us your time today.
Peter, it's wonderful to be here.
Thank you so much. And so much to happen. Obviously, people can follow you. There is your handle on X and obviously Epoch Times. And I've certainly subscribed and I benefit from all the information Epoch Times put out at a minuscule cost. And I would encourage the viewers and listeners to go and make use of the initial sign up and then use Epoch Times, all the information, all the interviews, everything that Jan and many others put out. So there is there is my promo for you, Jan. Anything else you want to throw into that before we start?
Well, no, that's wonderful. And indeed, we are largely supported. I mean, the vast percentage we're supported by our individual subscribers. So thank you for encouraging that, because that's our lifeblood. That's how we keep the lights on. That's how we can stay independent and have news and information that really nobody else can have.
Well, it's the only way we function and survive in this current climate. Now, we had different chats before, and maybe if we could start looking at Charlie Kirk and what has happened. I've talked to many UK friends. I was at the Charlie Kirk vigil a couple of days ago. I've talked to a number of US, but it's the first time I've sat and done an interview with someone post what has happened with the assassination of Charlie Kirk. And we discussed a number of clips, and maybe we can start with the Tulsi Gabbard clip from the Kennedy Convention Center there, and a number of people had messaged me to say they were there honoring Charlie and his life. But here is a minute with Tulsi Gabbard speaking about her thoughts, and maybe we can pick up on that. So here is Tulsi.
Those who are full of anger and hopelessness and hate right now, some of them protesting outside this hall today, unfortunately, they do not have the spiritual happiness that Charlie experienced. They're empty, and this is where their anger is coming from. It is their rejection of God, their desire to be God, and therefore they have made God their enemy. I have hope today that every one of us will do our best to shine the light of God's love in our lives and in our work, that we will treat each other with aloha, respect, and stand strong and unshakable in the defense of our God-given rights and freedoms. May God bless you all, and may God bless this great nation. Aloha.
And I want to leave the last 20 seconds, which was applause, off a just over 1 minute video, because I think the sense of appreciation, support, outpouring of grief and connection with Charlie. But maybe you can give us your thoughts as a citizen there, watching Tulsi Gabbard speak, the head of national intelligence. Maybe give us your thoughts on that speech and everything that we have witnessed over the last week.
It was, I mean, still an unbelievably shocking thing. I mean, it's almost like this sense of kind of surreal feeling has lasted, at least for me, until now, even as people are truly, really starting to grieve and trying to come to terms with what's happened. This, first of all, unbelievable loss. And let me explain why in particular. I mean, any loss of this sort, of course, is completely unconscionable, but Charlie was kind of unique in a couple of particular respects that I've been reflecting on. And I think why there's been such a, I guess, strong reaction to I mean strong reaction of the sort that you just saw, right? In terms of the applause to director Gabbard, DNI Gabbard. So at first he was someone that he would go anywhere basically in America and talk to people. You know, you hear about flyover country, right? And even, you know, basically he was viewed as someone who really was authentically understood and could connect with almost any American, right? And he tried hard. This is the other part, you know, obviously among conservatives, he was known this way, and he would go all sorts of places where frankly even some other conservatives didn't go very often in this flyover country. But the other thing was that his whole purpose, this tour that he was doing when he was, you know, when he was assassinated, was an attempt to reach out to the so-called other side, to people who in some cases vociferously rejected what he believed, and to have a conversation, to reach out and try to create dialogue where you know, powerful forces have been trying to prevent that from happening. And so, I mean, and there, I can't even think of anyone else who did this so effectively. And this is actually, you know, you showed that speech by DNI Gabbard, by Tulsi, and something else she said as part of that speech, which was, I think, like really profound, was, you know, someone had called her, and I'm going to paraphrase here because I don't remember exactly, but someone had called her and said, you know, Charlie tried to reach out, you know, kind of across to the other side, and now he failed. You know, they killed him, right? And 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 so this approach has failed. Basically, that was the sentiment that the person was sharing. And Tulsi responds. She's characterizing it. She said, "No, no, it actually did work." Right? The person's right. The person said this didn't work. Right? This approach didn't work. And Tulsi said, "No, no, it did work." And that's why he was silenced. That's why he was killed. And I think this is so. What's really important is, right, that this is the thing that can actually work, right? In emotion, I've encountered all sorts of folks around who, in their initial reaction, are thinking that thought, like dialogue isn't going to work anymore. We have to, you know, something like that, right? We have to go to more extreme measures. And this, from, you know, everything, you know, spend decades now trying to understand communism and how that system works and how it divides society and how it tries to, you know, basically get the two sides to fight each other, right? Yuri Bezmenov famously talked about this, right? There's this period of demoralization first, and then you get to the second period in the process that the Soviets were trying to impose on America and the West, and destabilizing, and that's getting these people kind of agitated, and then finally, it actually doesn't. The whole point isn't to get the left-wing people, the communists, to be in charge immediately. No, the whole purpose is to get the two sides fighting with each other physically, right? To create a crisis. And then and on the ashes of that, the totalitarians take over. So, you know, it was really powerful to hear that from her, because that, I think, the inspiration that I see, like, you know, once you get through this initial shock and reaction and just kind of horror, frankly, of what happened, right? Like, this was, you know, a live streamed, you know, murder seen on television. You know, guys shot incredibly popular host who so many people have this kind of relationship with, right? By watching and learning from and so forth, suddenly being tragically ended with a shot. Once you get through that, it's like, no, this is what he was doing was that, like, this is, and actually Bobby Kennedy in that same event that you just telecast from, he commented on this as well. He said, you know, we should kind of bring you bring the best, again paraphrasing, best character traits of Charlie, of which there were many, right, into ourselves. And I think this character trait, and I mean, I think this is also through his faith as a believing Christian, that he didn't treat the people that he was talking to, the people that were, even those people that might have been, outside believing all sorts of horrible things about him, he didn't treat them as his enemy. I mean, there's just such a powerful, indeed, this is really the only way, right? The only way to deal with, in my opinion, trying to make, a very fractured, demoralized, destabilized society whole again, right?
Yeah.
It's incredibly hard work, and there's going to be attrition. And we saw, kind of someone making the ultimate sacrifice for doing that extremely difficult work. I wanted to inspire me to continue that incredibly difficult work of, again, trying to make this really fractured society whole, with some people who are, deeply committed to even, destabilizing it further.
No.
I just want to qualify one more thing, right? Sometimes when you talk this way, people are saying, well, but justice must be done. And I'd say, yeah, absolutely. Justice must be done. This is why we have a justice system, right? And we want it to function properly and bring people who do these horrible things to justice, by the full force of the law, and any other people that are involved. And this needs to happen simultaneously, right? Even as because most of the people, even the most really, people who have maybe been, deranged by all this, by these, twisted far left ideologies, they're not out to kill people, right? There's a few, and those need to be stopped and dealt with, and with extreme severity. But that's not most people.
Download the Getter app right now. It's totally free. It's where I put up exclusively all of my content 24 hours a day. You want to know what Steve Bannon's thinking? Go to Getter.
So don't wait. Download the Getter app now.
Sign up for free and be part of the movement.
I want to touch on Bobby Kennedy's comments at the center, 10 minutes, and we put this up as Hearts of Oak, the whole 9.5 or 10 minutes for people to view it. There's so many takeaways, but one thing actually you had sent over to me was Scott Adams, and I hadn't seen his post, although I watch Scott Adams regularly. Of course, the creator of Dilbert, someone who has been censored because of his concerns of the culture clash that we have in the West. But here was Scott Adams' post, and it was, wait until the haters of Charlie Kirk find out their anger is based entirely on quotes taken out of context and flat out lies about what he said. Cognitive dissidents will glue most of the haters to their original positions with word salad explanations of how they have been proven wrong, yet they are really right. But some will experience unbearable sadness and deep shame over their actions this week that's coming. And I guess this fits in, Jan, with your world in the media, putting forward what is really happening, truth. And there is so much information coming out. Sometimes people don't know what to make sense of it. I think Scott Adams saying, actually, people will find out that the hatred they have of an individual will be based on a lie. And they will find out eventually, whenever they look at everything that Charlie has put out, that he was someone of compassion, of love, of engagement, and never any hatred. Be it your thoughts as someone in the media on how you present truth. How did you see what Scott Adams put up there?
Well, I mean, think about it, right? We're kind of live in this crazy ecosystem where we live in a world where social media is how media functions now, and it's become a kind of a primary way of functioning. And even among existing more traditional media, like say television, people have kind of separated into these different silos, much as what social media does in a more extreme way, right? And this is, I mean, this is frankly a huge challenge for the future, I think, because, for example, right, there's all sorts of people out there that have been fed. There's been fed a whole bunch of things. One is they've been fed a bunch of false, outright false, or very dramatically out of context statements from Charlie that would make him out to be some kind of hateful person or something of this nature, right? The second thing they've been fed is they've been told you are over time actually you're right to feel hatred when you see such language, such hateful language, right? Neither of these things are are a good thing, but in these silos that social media creates, right? You can there's beautiful things. You can have a silo of people that are deeply committed to supporting a certain kinds of human rights of work. Okay, for example, or the forced organ harvesting industry, which is something that I work on, and you can bring people from all over the world, even people who are just discovering it on board and get inspired and work together. It's a beautiful thing. You can also, you know, uh, bring people together who are into self-harm, and there's whole subreddits and hashtags on X and things like that that focus around people who are doing this to themselves and almost like showing off to each other about what they've done. I mean, it's incredibly disturbing, right? And normally in a normal world these people wouldn't have come together. They would have someone would have said, hey, listen, this is probably not good for you. Let me help let me help you in the ideal world, right? Kind of they would have gotten help instead of being reinforced in that behavior, which is clearly very, very destructive. And this is some of these very critical theory built leftist ideologies. Some of it's exactly some of those kinds of frames of mind which are kind of exalted, and then you can end up with these silos where, like I just described, right, where people are fed bad information. They believe that information is true because that's what their friends, that's what their peer group, this is what everybody is reinforcing. Everybody agrees this is true. It doesn't matter how far from reality it is. And furthermore, there's a kind of a culture that's been developed that says, hating people that are hateful is the right thing to do, and in fact you should kind of relish in that, right? And that's the kind of thing you hear. And at this point it's very difficult, and this is what people write. This is why someone like Charlie is so important in our society, and why people are so shocked by the event, but also like so in a way kind of engaged, why this is becoming this profound cultural moment, because he signified in some ways the best of people who are willing to work hard to bridge that gap, right, to people who have been kind of harmed in this way, right? And it didn't mean that the other part was that he was very courageous and clear on his principles. He didn't shirk from that, right? But at the same time, he was ready to engage anyone and ready to not judge them, right? Just simply to have a conversation. That's rare. And again, this is to paraphrase Secretary Kennedy, Bobby. This is a character trait which I want to be incorporating, into my own disposition, way of being.
Well, let me pull up some of that, and I've got the whole. Let me see. I've got the whole clip from that. Let me pull up one, which was just the Kennedy Center people breaking out into worship, which was part of Charlie's thing. Let me just play like a 10-second clip of that, and then let me go over onto Bobby Kennedy, 9.5 minutes, but we'll jump into the middle on some of those comments on taking the best of who Charlie was and applying it to ourselves. But let me play this first clip.
To follow Jesus
So that was something I've decided to follow Jesus, no turning back, no turning back, and one that I remember singing as a kid, and that commitment to what you believe, and that was certainly Charlie. Let me bring up this other clip of Bobby Kennedy's speech, and let me see if I can pull it into the middle. Let's try this.
We do that by taking the best virtues and character traits of the person that we lost and using discipline and restraint and practice, integrating those character traits into our own character. And in doing that, we make ourselves larger and the whole gets proportionally smaller. And we also give that person a kind of immortality because they are now living on, the best parts of them are now living on in us. In one of my conversations, and Charlie was a target-rich environment for virtues. We can all think of something extraordinary that his love of family, his love of God, his love of freedom of speech, his reverence for this country, his belief that we are an exemplary nation. We are unique in history. We're the only nation with this kind of constitution. In Europe, they don't have free speech anymore. We have it here, and we are the beacon for humanity for the rest of the world. And all of those.
I could go into all of that, but there were two. He ended off but saying that the US is the beacon of free speech to the world. The Europe doesn't have free speech. 100% correct, 1000% correct. And we sit together, Jan, whenever President Trump is heading. I think as we speak, his flight is actually in the air heading to the UK. But it was one other part of that, and his comment: we should bring Charlie's best character traits into our character. And it is looking at, I guess, those who have gone before and making sure we grab onto what they gave to the world and seeing how we can learn and take those into our lives. And that's a concept, I guess, that's been through generations, looking at those who've gone before us, taking what they stood for, applying it to ourselves so we can carry that torch ahead for us. But yeah, we should bring our best character traits into our character. That's a line for all of us really to take, isn't it, Jan?
I completely agree. And you mentioned earlier, I think you were talking about American citizens, and so for me, I'm Canadian, right? But I'm someone who values the American idea, just as Bobby Kennedy talked about today. That it's a unique country in so many ways, and in a ways that I particularly appreciate. And I'm looking, of course, to the best of it, not the worst of it, right? It's kind of warts and all, as they say. And so it's my hope. I will very much like to become a citizen, of course, of America. I mean, maybe that's not of course, but it is for me, because I do feel this is sort of the cradle of freedom, again, with all its massive challenges right now. But this is how this plays out, right? We get to do our best part to support freedom and faith and liberty and a society where people where we value individual agency and innovation and merit and all those things that are and most importantly, right, conscience and speech, right, as is the case in the First Amendment, and hopefully become more and more of a beacon again of those virtues. But we're here in America. it remains by far the one of the most free countries of the world, if not the most. You could debate the exact details of that, but it's because, and part of it is having that discussion and figuring that out, right?
No, absolutely. And look, I really want to get your thoughts on Charlie, and I hope and pray that President Trump coming out, JD Vance has put a spotlight here in the UK and in Europe on our curtailment of free speech. And I do hope and pray that President Trump's visit over the next few days will also shine a light on our failures in the UK. And I know Charlie's legacy rings true, whether you're a US citizen, whether you're in the UK, whether they're across Europe, whether you're in East Asia, wherever it is. I know it rings true. Um, but Jan, I also want to talk to you about an issue which Charlie maybe didn't flag up that much, and that is the position of China, the CCP, and the curtailment of our freedoms from that angle. And this is something I know you've been very vocal about for a long time. And it was this regarding TikTok, which seemed to be a tool of the CCP. And it was this story in the BBC just a day before, so 2 days before we record this. US says framework for TikTok ownership deal agreed with China. It says Washington has agreed a framework deal with China on TikTok's US operations, paving the way for American ownership as the world's two biggest economies negotiate a trade deal. And I understand this has been postponed twice. This is now the third deadline. And President Trump has been very vocal of this in terms of TikTok influencing the US negatively. And he seems to want to get a grip on this. This seems to be positive, but let us know your thoughts on this. Is this going to change TikTok's role? Is it that it has to just come into ownership of the US? Does this affect the CCP's influence on the US? And it's used TikTok in a very, very clever way the West maybe wasn't aware of prior to President Trump coming in the White House. So give us your whole take on this.
Well, Peter, so I'm on record having, I've lectured on this. I've been on podcasts on this topic. I've certainly been very vocal about it. The fact that I believe that TikTok is possibly the most powerful tool in the Chinese Communist Party's rather robust unrestricted warfare arsenal. Unrestricted warfare means largely war by other means than what we think of typically as kinetic warfare, right? But I'm using that in the most broadest sense, which I would include the entirety of the CCP's warfare capabilities. And I mentioned the CCP's warfare capabilities because, for example, the People's Liberation Army is not the army. A lot of people don't know this is not the army of China. It's the army of the Chinese Communist Party, right? And so it's like having, a supremacist political party control a military, and then indeed it's one of the key ways in which the CCP stays in power. So why is it? I mean, there's a nuclear arsenal. There's all sorts. There's aircraft carriers now that have been multiplying, so to speak. They have quite the arsenal at their disposal. But I would argue that they've been the most effective in their influence operations, in their political warfare, in their information warfare. And really, TikTok is this unbelievably powerful tool of this, and it does this in a couple of ways. Okay, the first way is kind of the obvious one, which is that it can gather all intelligence. It's unusually invasive, and this has been demonstrated in sucking all possible data out of the system, right? That's on your phone, and of course, everything that's on the screen that's ever you're recording off of your camera or the screen, that is all gets sort of pulled and used to profile you, to build an extensive digital identity of you, and what your likes are, what your dislikes, what types of things you're into, what books you read, are you can sort of imagine. There's actually a great film called the Social Dilemma? That's what the name that's running into my mind right now, which is explained how powerful social media are in general in terms of this ability to kind of profile and pull all this information and create this digital identity, which in some ways even understands you better than some things you understand yourself, right? Because it looks at your facial expressions, involuntary movement, all this kind of stuff. So that exists. They're building, and we know the CCP is building profiles on every American. Why? Well, could be useful, right? And plus, AI is unbelievably data hungry, right? This is part of the feed into their kind of AI development systems. Now, having this unbelievable, for example, how Facebook advertising traditionally has been unbelievably effective, right? Why is it effective? Because Facebook, like TikTok, is developing these very deep profiles of its users, and then it can micro target advertising to very, very thin slices of the population that are kind of exactly what the marketer wants, and that is of course of huge value to people who are looking to market. So that exists, right, in the TikTok system. So you can now imagine a situation where this is in the hands of a regime that is waging, to use the People's Daily, the China Daily, the mouthpiece for the CCP, a people's war against America, right? A regime that enables in many, many different ways mass fentanyl to arrive in America and wipe off the map perhaps 40,000 military-aged males a year, Americans, right? So, I could develop some of these ideas further, but this is, now we have a tool that knows a lot about you if you're a TikTok user, and it can micro target messaging to you of a whole variety of sorts. And an example I can offer, right, is exactly if we go back to what happened last week. And, so when something like horrible like this happens, we go into first we have an emotional reaction, as we should, as is expected, right? And then we might be thinking things like, the time for conversation is over. I'm ready to fight. These people can't be reasoned with, whatever that is, right? Later on, you think to yourself, wait a second, how did Charlie Kirk approach this? This was not the way. Let me get a hold of myself, right? This would be kind of the normal process someone would go through. However, in a situation like if you're a heavy TikTok user, right, you could be fed more information. They could dial up the amount of the types of messaging, which there was a ton of, right, that says, no, you're right to feel that indignation, you're right, there's the time for talking is over. And you could do that. They can do that with plausible deniability. They'll say, hey, it's just the algorithm. Look at all these Americans, they just believe this. That's why you're being fed this. You believe that. And that's what you're being fed, right? This has nothing to do with the Chinese military. What are you talking about, Jan? Right? What I mean is, and you can multiply this in all sorts of ways, like in the various riots in 2020, for example. There was, they were feeding information on how to, basically do Antifa resistance and things like that, right? To presumably people that were, they knew to be predisposed to doing that kind of stuff, right? So it's it's an unbelievably powerful tool, and it's not a question with them of if, it's just a question of how, and whether you can measure it, and whether it can fit outside the realm of this, plausible deniability, because that's indeed how unrestricted warfare works. That's how the CCP operates. Ideally, right, in their ideal world, traditionally, they can say, I really didn't do anything. Fentanyl, really? Like, Americans are just really, drug abusers. What are you talking about? We have nothing to do with fentanyl. Sorry, we're trying to help, stop it. But of course, if you understand how the CCP works, that's ridiculous. That's a ridiculous assertion. You can think of it like, a bit like how the mob works, where the the Politburo is kind of the top Don, the top group, and indeed they use organized crime sort of functions as a kind of arm as well. And, so when the Don decides that there's going to be no fentanyl, you can be pretty sure pretty quickly there's going to be no fentanyl, given that you manufacture the presses, you launder the money, you teach people how to make the products, you manufacture all the products, you get them shipped. Anyway, you're a big part. There's so many different pieces of that operation that sit on within the Chinese Communist Party's auspices. But they'll say, hey, we can't help. Sorry, we tried. We're trying really hard, but you guys got to get your act together. There's all these addicted people, right? This is this nature of unrestricted warfare. This is how it works. So TikTok, going back to your initial question, I think is a unbelievably. I think it's completely unacceptable to have a tool that powerful in the hands of a regime that seeks to openly subvert America.
No, absolutely. And I share your huge concern to the effect that TikTok has on influencing the West for the CCP's purpose. And we delve into that, but I want to end on your upcoming book. It's not coming up anytime soon. It's early next year, I think February next year. But it is, and I know we've touched base on this before, and it's the organ harvesting issue, which I'm sure you've been called many names for highlighting this, and now the conspiracy theorists seem to actually be producing the information and the truth about this. Tell us a little bit about how the organ harvesting issue, how that, I guess, feeds in to the nature of the Chinese Communist Party. And there is which I said to you prior to jumping on, it's a very hard-hitting title, Kill to Order, Chinese Organ Harvesting Industry and the True Nature of America's Biggest Adversary. And we've seen Falun Gong's demonstrations all over in different places. I've seen them in London. I see them when I travel. And they've been dismissed as crackpots. But as I've talked to you, as I've delved into this, talked to others, this seems to be a legitimate issue which is happening. And of course, this was linked to the hot mic moment between Putin and Xi Jinping earlier this month, where they talked about immortality, about discussing organ transplants, living to 150 years old. And it kind of gave you a little bit of an insight into the minds of these two people that very few of us see. But again, your thoughts on this issue and maybe how that hot mic moment exposes what really is happening behind the scenes.
The hot mic moment was likewise, we were talking about surreal moments, or looking at reality and that seems surreal. That was a very surreal moment for me, because for the past 20 odd years, it was about 20 years ago when I realized that this issue was actually real. I as most people, when they're faced with the idea that prisoners of conscience, basically religious believers who are on the wrong side of a communist regime, who are incarcerated, are used at scale as unwilling organ donors for $1 billion industry, and in an unlimited way, ultimately for the elites that run that regime. That is sounds like science fiction. There's movies that are kind of in that genre. You don't want to, and you just naturally, you have this revulsion. You say, no, that can't be happening. And, 2006 actually was when I realized, no, this is very much happening. I had to, kind of face the evidence, if you will, after being a little bit incredulous, to be perfectly honest, on my own side, even knowing, maybe more than the average person on what evil communist regimes of the past have actually managed to do. And it's quite extreme. But this is just a whole, as David Matus, who's one of the key researchers over the years on this issue, has said, it's an evil yet to be seen on this planet, right? And so that's kind of what it was. And we were trying, trying to understand that there's a few pieces to it really quick that can help see the picture. I was actually I just learned of a very credible anecdote of someone as early as 2002 having had a liver transplant arranged for them within the span of 3 days of that request being made, because they were, kind of an unusually connected individual. Again, these anecdotes are very rare to find. People don't want to admit that this sort of thing happens, but this is someone who is kind of on the side of party to this. This is new information, right? The most sort of common example that I give was an Israeli patient who was waiting for a heart back in 2005, needed one urgently, and told his transplant surgeon that he was going to get it in 2 weeks in China. The transplant surgeon, Jakob Levy, didn't believe him, but the guy went and got it done. And he was like, here we go, right? So how is that even possible? How can you schedule a heart transplant? You have to know when someone's going to be dead. So it means you're making someone dead. Okay. They'll say it's an organ, they'll say it's a death row prisoner that's giving the organ. That's what they'll tell people. They also say there's a lot of people in China. That was one kind of reason that was given to someone that was, wondering, how can you get this organ so quickly? But the only way you can really do that is to, and this is what we figured out with other evidence by interviewing people who had been in the system and escaped in the labor camp, forced labor camp, re-education through labor camp, prison system, was that these people, a lot of people, notably the Falun Gong practitioners, which had been incarcerated, by the millions since the early 2000s, they were saying that they were getting these very invasive and extensive medical tests being done, which was weird because they were just torturing them to kind of force them to renounce their beliefs, right? But so it wouldn't make sense that they would be doing this, but the researchers figured out, wait a sec, okay, so they're building a database, right? So now we have a database of people, their blood types, tissue types, and everything else, and that's how, and it's across the country, so that's how we can have these incredibly short wait times, right? And of course, a lot of people disappeared, a lot of people were, and it's a very vulnerable population, because literally at one point, according to the Special Rapporteur on Torture at the UN, half of everybody in these camps were Falun Gong practitioners. So and that the industry just kind of starts skyrocketing in terms of the number of hospitals which are being built right when they start persecuting the Falun Gong. So this is just there's a whole mass of evidence around it, but that's just to give you a bit of a taste of the stuff that we were seeing early on that made me realize, oh wow, this is real. Right? This is not science fiction. And so, as I've been looking at this for 20 years, I realized, if you just take this whole issue and all its dimensions, right, and how it works, and, frankly, how little has been done to try to stop it by people who might have had the ability to kind of at least, encourage in that direction. It's like the one issue that can actually help you understand how this regime actually works, and how you might, if you're gonna, decide to engage with the CCP in various ways, or the system, or companies that are in that country or whatnot, you might want to understand how this whole thing works to understand how you're going to actually engage with them. Because if you assume that it's someone that's kind of like you, on the other side of the businessman that's on the other side of the aisle, so to speak, and that you're partnering with, because if you're investing, say you have a business investment in China, you have to have a partner, and you have to transfer your technology to them, and like who is it that you're really dealing with, and what allegiances, I guess, do they have, right? So critical. So I'll add one more thing, and this is actually very relevant to the TikTok question as much as it's to this issue, right? There's a national intelligence law in China that basically says, if the regime officials need you to provide intelligence, cooperate in any way, you must do that. For example, inform on someone you're working with, or cooperate with the authorities to do their will with respect to that interaction. And you're also not allowed, it's against the law for you to admit that you're doing that, to actually disclose that fact. And that's the reality that every Chinese lives under, right? That's working with anybody in the West, right? So even if, I'm surprised they actually made that law, because they could institute this kind of a policy without having it codified into law, in fact, right? It's not, there's a whole lot of things over there that work like that, but they decided to state this explicitly. Right. So imagine, so you have like, TikTok saying, hey, we don't provide data to the Chinese regime, right? It's like, but wait, your company is Communist Party members involved, and they're like, no, we don't. But you couldn't, according to law, you couldn't actually disclose that you're doing that, right? According to the National Intelligence Law. Anyway, so it's in this similar. It of course applies to this organ harvesting question very directly as well.
Well, yeah, I really appreciate you coming on, not only discussing what's happening with Charlie Kirk assassination, and although you're Canadian, you hide that well, if I can say that. I see as a American being there in DC with Epoch Times, but thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. And obviously the TikTok story was timely in us discussing that and the role of the CCP. And of course, I look forward to your book, Kill to Order, coming out in February next year. So thank you so much for giving us your time, Jan.
It's a real pleasure, and I just realized that I never fully answered your question about the hot mic moment, because I mean the bottom line is they basically said our purpose is to use organ harvesting to live forever, right? That was or at least 150 years, as Xi Jinping said. So that was what made it so particularly surreal, right? Because it's like, essentially validating a thesis of the book that I just, have been organized to write a couple of weeks earlier. And I'm grateful for that, because I hope that might be an opportunity for people to understand the nature of the Chinese regime better and act accordingly when dealing with it.
Well, I look forward to interviews with Putin and Xi Jinping, although I don't know if they'll be forthcoming in the book. But yeah, thank you so much for giving us your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Peter.